flowers or seeds, and these are generally smaller and harder to find. Fungi, a group which include these mushrooms, don't have flowers or seeds. Neither do algae. Algae are the simplest green plants. Mosses are more complex, but they don't have flowers or seeds either. The same is true of ferns, a group of plants related to the mosses. Let's think about these four kinds of plants that have no flowers or seeds: the algae, the mosses, the ferns, and the fungi, and learn about how they grow and reproduce. We'll begin with the algae. Some algae are so tiny that we need a microscope to see them clearly. Here, algae cells are reproducing. Single cells are dividing into new cells exactly alike. All algae can reproduce in this way. There are many kinds of algae. Filamentous algae are made up of strings of cells, attached end to end. Some algae grow quite large, especially those which grow in salt water and are referred to as seaweed. Algae vary in color, but they all contain chlorophyll, the green matter in plants which makes food. All algae are green plants. Like the algae, mosses and ferns are also green plants. Mosses and ferns are similar to each other. They grow and reproduce. Of different types, we see that each fern has branching leaves called fronds. The structure of ferns is more complicated than that of algae. So is the manner in which a fern reproduces. On the underside of this frond are many tiny spore cases, each containing dozens of microscopic spores. Spores are produced by both ferns and mosses, and are one means by which each of these kinds of plants reproduce. Tiny spores, like dust, can be carried by wind or water to a new place where they can grow. A fern spore grows into a tiny plant that doesn't look like the parent plant, but it's still a fern. Let's look at this tiny fern plant in a diagram to show a second way ferns reproduce, by combining cells. The tiny fern plant produces male or sperm cells on one part and female or egg cells on another. When the plant is wet with dew or rain, male cells can move to egg cells and combine with them. Over a period of several weeks, the combined cell will grow into a new plant, just like the first fern we saw. Eventually, this fern will produce spores on the underside of its fronds, which in turn will grow into new ferns. Mosses also reproduce by two methods, by special cells and by spores. Moss spores are in the little capsules at the ends of each stalk. All algae, ferns, and mosses are green plants that make their own food. The fungi are not green plants and cannot make their own food. The simplest of the fungi are the bacteria, which are microscopic plants. Since they cannot make their own food, they take it from other plant or animal life. In taking food, bacteria can be harmful. These bacteria cause the disease tuberculosis. They are harmful to us because they make use of cells of the human body for food. Some kinds of bacteria are helpful. Here, for example, a liquid containing bacteria is being added to milk to make it curdle to form cheese. Using time-lapse photography, we can see a strand of bacteria reproducing. All bacteria reproduce by division. Another group of fungi is made up of the yeasts. Yeasts are similar to bacteria, only larger. Like bacteria, yeasts also reproduce by division. Yeast, you may know, is used in cooking. It is added to dough before it is baked into bread. Using time-lapse photography, we can show how bread rises as the yeast forms gas bubbles in the dough. Another kind of fungi has grown in this moist piece of bread. The growth is called a mold. Molds, like other fungi, cannot make their own food. Different kinds of molds grow on different kinds of animal and vegetable materials, which the molds use for food. Under a microscope, we can see the structure of a mold. From the root-like mold network, slender stalks grow upward, forming spore containers at their tips. In each container, there are dozens of tiny spores. Spores, remember, are one means by which plants without flowers or seeds can reproduce. Mold spores drift through the air and land on animal or plant materials, such as these pea plants. The spores begin to grow, developing into the mold we see here. The damage to the pea pods is the result of the mold making use of the pods for food. You can see how mold can damage crops. Here is some mold growing on the stump of a tree. As the mold consumes the material of the stump, the wood decays. Molds are one of the chief agents of decay in living things. Near the stump is another type of fungi that grows in dark, moist places. The mushrooms. Let's look at one more closely. The mushroom has a stalk and a cap, which is actually a spore container. We can get a good look at the spores produced in the cap by removing it from the stalk and allowing it to remain on a piece of paper for a day or so. The pattern formed on the paper is made up of thousands of tiny spores which have fallen from the mushroom cap. Mushrooms reproduce by means of these spores. Mushrooms for food are grown by planting the root-like parts, which develop underground. These are placed in trays of decaying matter. Soon, little knobs or buttons push through the surface. Finally, they develop stalks and caps of the familiar umbrella form we recognize as mushrooms. Closely related to the mushrooms is another type of fungi, the puffballs, which also reproduce by powder-like spores. Fungi, remember, are not green plants and cannot make their own food. Plants that can make their own food are the algae. Algae are the simplest types of green plants. Mosses are more complex green plants, as are the ferns. All of these are plants that have no flowers or seeds.